This is not the view of the Gallic monks, all right? Plain and simple. Read the primary sources. Read the primary sources. Hi guys, this is Dr. Kurt Jarris, and I'm trying a new type of response video. It's not just a quick 2 to 5 minute video, but rather something a bit more long form and engaging. And I wanted to pick something in my wheelhouse. So last week there was a video by J.D. Martin, What is Semi-Pelagianism, on his Exploring Theology channel. And in case you're not aware, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the so-called Semi-Pelagians. Here's the work, University of Aberdeen, finished right before the pandemic, so it's been a few years now. And I really have a heart for defending the reputation of the Gallic monks, as I call them. I think that they've basically gotten a bad rap in popular theological circles, and a number of systematic theologians have misunderstood them, whereas historical theologians, by and large, have it right. And so yeah, I'm gonna go through and watch this video. I haven't listened to it, I don't know the arguments, but we're gonna keep this recording, and you can see sort of what I think about Martin's views here. And I've queued up the YouTube video, so I'll be using the timestamps from this video when I communicate some ideas here, and also I've sped it up to 1.5 time. That way we can maybe run through this a little faster, because it is a longer, it's 38 minutes. So here we go.
Welcome to Exploring Theology. I'm your host, J.D. Martin, and today we're going to talk about the subject of semi-Pelagianism. We hear that term thrown out. Some people don't like it. Most people don't like it. It's usually a derogatory term. But nevertheless, it is a term that is either ignored or redefined, or just people are so confused about this term that I thought I figured that I would explain it. And so in order to explain semi-Pelagianism, we have to really go through the entire spectrum. Now again, this term can be weaponized, but that's not really the point. The point is we need to be able to figure out and communicate to one another of where we fit on the theological spectrum.
So I'm already 40 seconds in. Yes, the term can be weaponized, and it's usually a derogatory term, this term Semi-Pelagianism. And he's making a good point about being able to realize where we are on a spectrum of beliefs. My main beef with the term itself is that the definition and description of this concept is applied to the Gallic monks, and the term itself wasn't around until the writings of Theodore Beza, who was a disciple of John Calvin. So you're looking at Protestant Reformation era, and these Gallic monks lived in the 5th century, and so there's 1,000 years here between these guys, and they never would have accepted this label Semi-Pelagian. So let's hear what else JD has to say on the term.
Early on in church history, there was a guy named Pelagius and a guy named Augustine, and they had a big debate that the church has really been debating ever since. And the question is what is the relationship between God's grace and man's free will? And so you have full-on Augustinianism over here, and then you have full-on Pelagianism over here. And in between those two positions, you have a view that says Semi-Pelagianism and Semi-Augustinianism. And so the Semi-Pelagianism, while it can be used as a derogatory term.
Okay, so first, this is where doing the historical work can be very important, because I see this sometimes in the theology books. I don't quite want to say scholarship, because the academic scholarship is sort of next level hardcore analysis, and sometimes theology books can be geared more towards students, for example. Material that's synthesized, and synthesized poorly sometimes. So here Martin says that it's a term that's sort of in between Augustinianism and Pelagianism. You're going to see this sometimes where people will say that John Cassian tried to build a middle way, build a bridge between the two camps, and that's just not true. John Cassian carried over Eastern Greek theology to the West. And so it's not like he created and tried to take the bests of both camps. That's really not a fair description.
Basically says that Pelagius was more right, and free will was more important or more so correct than Augustinianism. Semi-Augustinianism said no, Augustine was more so right on this issue. So let's define. In order to define Semi-Pelagianism, we have to again define Pelagianism, Semi-Augustinianism, and Augustinianism, and we'll get the full spectrum. And what you're going to see is that these views are still here and alive today. And so pretty much everyone that you can fit in is going to be somewhere in this spectrum, whether they want to use that term or not. So what was Pelagius' view in the sense of...
at 150, pausing here, Martin says you've got these four views: Augustinianism, Semi-Augustinianism, Semi-Pelagianism, and Pelagianism, and everybody alive sort of fits in these categories. I'm actually going to say, hold up, actually, no, that's not the case. Here's the problem with Martin's spectrum, and the problem that I frequently see even in these contemporary debates that Protestants are having. One of the problems for Augustine was that he pitted the grace of God against the free will of man. He tried to figure out which one came first. Now, he admits this in multiple writings of his, including letters that he wrote to people. And he says, at the end of the day, the grace of God wins out. Well, here's the problem with that. It becomes a false dichotomy that when a man freely chooses to do something, well, what sort of initiates that? Is it the grace of God, or is it the free will of man choosing? What comes first, right? It becomes an either or. And for the Greek thinkers, including John Cassian, it's a both and. It's not an either or. It's a both and. So the spectrum that Martin's building here, that everyone fits into one of these four camps, is actually just false. They're not the only four camps, because these four camps are playing by those rules of the either-or game. Cassian and others don't play by that game. So we really are going to come to a misunderstanding between the theology of the Gallic monks and these very Protestant ways of systematizing and categorizing people and how they fit into these positions. So you're going to find, as I would argue, that Cassian doesn't fit into any of these positions that Martin's about to lay out. And I know he's going to go this direction because I've seen it before. I haven't watched this video, but I know where he's going.
In the sense of a Pelagianism versus Augustinianism versus and Semi-Augustinianism. What was his view? His view was that the fall of Adam only affected Adam. And so he's a bad example, but we are all our new Adams. We're all just like, if I do something bad, it doesn't pass on to my child. It can pass on to them by way of imitation or something of that sort. But fundamentally, the nature of a child is no different than the nature of Adam. The nature of Adam did not affect his offspring. And so Pelagius believed, just like pretty much everybody, that Adam could have done right or wrong. He could have obeyed God's law or disobeyed God's law. Okay, and so that's Pelagianism.
So Martin's
and so
right
that's
here
the same
on
Adam, and you're the same. You're no different in nature than Adam. Then when you're born into the world, you too, just like Adam, could do right or to simply do wrong. You're kind of in this neutral state, and then you get influenced left or right, but you don't. Basically, it's complete denial of total depravity.
I do want to pause here at 250 and say that the issues are more complex. There are others who dispute whether Pelagius even held to this. What I'm willing to say is that records do show that he backed away from these positions, but others did not. So it's sort of stuck around. And again, he's given the historical backdrop. And so that debate isn't one that I studied insanely in depth. My debate was more the debate after that debate.
There is no natural inclination or evil to sin. Everyone is back into that Adamic-like state, or everyone is already in that Adamic-like that. That's full-on Pelagianism. Of course, when it comes to someone preaching the gospel, hey, you have free will. I mean, God graciously, gave you an offer. God graciously preserved the word. God graciously told people to come preach to you, but he doesn't need to do anything in you. There's no extra grace. There's no internal grace. There's nothing like that for you to make a free will choice to believe in Jesus. Does that make sense? So you hear the gospel. That's God's grace. God's creation is grace. I mean, Pelagius would not deny that everything that we have is God's grace, but God doesn't need to do anything internally to you to cause you to be able to believe. That's what Pelagius said. Now, historically, pretty much everybody said Pelagius was wrong.
Let me pause here because he does talk about how divine grace functions. Martin says that God's grace is in everything, except that's just externally. So that's an important point to clarify. There's nothing internal to the human soul that God works. You are going to see in Cassian, there is this notion of an internal grace that functions. So again, but it's a both and type of work. And I should say work of a divine work.
Okay, that's really what happened. Now you can say, well, who cares about church history, whatever. Okay, I'm just telling you what happened is that people said, no, Pelagius, you have gone too far. They agreed with him based on the free will, but they said this idea that God doesn't need to do any internal thing, we think that contradicts scripture. So pretty much everybody condemned Pelagius, and that's why that Pelagius is now a bad guy. He's considered pretty much a heretic by everybody. I mean, we're talking across the board here. So let's move to Semi-Pelagianism. Right. So Semi-Pelagianism was what basically during the day of Augustine and Pelagius, they condemned Pelagius. They did not accept Augustine. And so they kind of went in between Semi-Pelagianism and Semi-Augustinianism. So we'll explain this. So Semi-Pelagianism said, no, Pelagius, you're wrong. We're not all a new Adam. That original sin did really corrupt our nature. And we are now fallen creatures who love evil and this and that. And so but we're not so radically depraved, like Augustine said, that God needs to do some internal act of God to even cause us to desire the good. We're fallen, we have sinful inclinations, but we can incline ourselves to the good, or we are still inclined to the good, and we can choose to want the good, basically. And so once again, the gospel is being preached. Somebody's hearing the gospel. Somebody says, that's good. I think I want that. And God then sees that person trying to believe.
Okay, let me pause here. 459. Martin's done a good job describing how the Gallic monks believed that the fall was not as bad as Augustine believed, and yet also how they differed from Pelagianism. In fact, John Cassian, Vincent of Lorenz, and Faustus of Fries, the last of the three there, his works have never been translated into English except for a few letters here and there. They all condemn Pelagianism as a heresy, so they all vehemently separate themselves. They do not do that, though, with Augustine. They present criticisms, and there's debate over what exactly constitutes as a criticism of Augustine. Was it a slighted critique or a softer critique? So it's there's debate in the scholarship on that. I do want to say here, though, this idea of man making the first move. Okay, so that is not the position that Cassian and company would hold. This idea that first it's the man and then God acts. Again, we see this either-or scenario. For Cassian, it's both and. You really need to understand Cassian's view of grace in order to understand his views of human free will. You need to understand that grace is an internal work, and that it's also variegated. There are different levels of grace that humans receive. And in Faustus, you have what's called the prima gratia, the first grace. So to speak of human nature as if it's devoid of grace, it could even exist without grace, is speaking in, to use more philosophical terms, a negative possible world. It doesn't exist. It can't exist. So human freedom exists because of the grace of God. Now, it's a different type of grace than what Calvinists want to say. I'm happy to grant that point. But we should not strawman the people we're critiquing. We need to understand them if we're going to critique them fairly and accurately. So as long as we're describing them accurately, you could say, yeah, okay, but I don't agree with that. That's fine. That's far more suitable than to just create this false picture of what the Gallic monks believed.
Trying to embrace it, saying, I want that, I want to believe, I want to be a Christian. And then God says, yes, I will not despise that willing heart. I see he's trying to go into my direction, but if I don't help him, if I don't assist him, if I don't do something, the conversion will never happen. He'll try and then fail completely, right? I mean, you can think about a drug addict maybe in this idea that some drug addicts potentially may, I want to be free, I want to be helped. If you do nothing, they'll just go right back to the drugs, right? But in that moment of them pushing into that direction, then if somebody comes in a system, they can complete the process and cause the regeneration and cause a new heart and a new change.
The drug addict analogy is an interesting one. Cassian gives a variety of examples on the types of person, and he even uses different biblical examples. If one were to pick up, say, Conference 13 in his work, The Conferences, I've got it there so you can see.
So again, what's the difference between Pelagianism and Semi-Pelagianism? Pelagianism, everyone's a new Adam. God essentially doesn't need to do anything as far as in the heart of the person. They have the full-on capacity to choose to believe the gospel or not to choose to believe the gospel. Semi-Pelagianism, everyone's not a new Adam. The sinful nature has corrupted him. He has all these evil desires and all these things. And yet, nevertheless, when he hears the gospel, God does not need that initial inclination to want to believe and to want to accept the things of God. God does not need to do anything.
Did you catch that? Let me reverse here at roughly about this. Let's start at 543.
God essentially doesn't need to do anything as far as in the heart of the person. They have the full-on capacity to choose to believe the gospel or not to choose to believe the gospel. Semi-Pelagianism.
So 552 here, he's talking about what Semi-Pelagianism is.
Everyone's not a new Adam. The sinful nature has corrupted him. He has all these evil desires and all these things. And yet, nevertheless, when he hears the gospel,
559, and yet, nevertheless, when he hears the gospel,
God does not need that initial inclination to want to believe.
The initial inclination.
And to want to accept the things of God. God does not need to do anything internal.
God doesn't need to do anything internal to the person. All right? So again, this is not the view of the Gallic monks. All right? Plain and simple. Read the primary sources. Read the primary sources. When you read the primary sources, you're going to see that this is not the belief of John Cassian or Faustus of Fries.
Them to even be able to have that initial inclination, but they can do that in and of themselves, but they cannot complete the process. They cannot fully embrace the gospel. They can start moving in that direction, but they cannot fully embrace the gospel until God sees, responds, and then gives them completing grace, if you want to think of it that way. So they can initiate the movement toward God.
Yeah, he calls it completing grace. This is not This is a terrible description of Cassian's view.
In response to the gospel, of course, but to complete the process, they need to complete the process, not of regeneration, but to complete the process of embracing and converting to God. They need God to assist and to aid, to grab his hand and say, come on, and get them all the way up there. So they can start jumping, and God just picks them up and completes that process of conversion, then regeneration. So I hope that helps. Now, and again, that was when the controversy between Pelagius and Augustine happened. They did not accept Pelagius. Everybody can just freely accept, and there's no effects from the fall. They rejected that. They also rejected Augustinianism. So maybe I should jump to Augustinianism real quick and then go back into semi-Augustinianism and then give you a summary of all these positions once more. So let's jump to Augustine's position. Augustine said, no, we are corrupted and we are fallen creatures, and that if God does not do a work in our hearts, then even when we hear the gospel.
All right, so pausing here at 7:29, Martin's going to go and give a longer description here of Augustinianism and semi-Augustinianism, and then he says he's going to recap. So I might not be able to, it might not be of interest to me to keep on watching this because I think he's botched this view. While he does this, though, I'm going to look up passages that Cassian says on grace. I have a section on it in my dissertation, so I'm just going to keep this rolling and look up a few passages so I can share them with you, so you can hear from the horse's mouth, the primary sources, what Cassian has to say on the work of divine grace.
Our sinful desires, our sinful nature, our sinful inclinations will never incline us to do good, and so we'll always reject. And so we need a supernatural impartation, a supernatural working of God in our inner being to cause us to be inclined to do good, to cause us to believe in the gospel. But not just that, he argued that when God does that work of opening the heart, of causing someone to be able to believe, to overcome their sinful radical nature, that this would necessarily, effectually, irresistibly cause the person to believe. And so this was a monergistic system. God decided to do this to some people. He did not decide to do it to others. And when God gave you this effectual, irresistible grace, you would necessarily believe. Again, people in Augustine's day did not embrace, by and large, Augustine's view, did not embrace, by and large, Pelagius' view. So there's one more position. And this is the Armenian position, also known as semi-Augustinian position, that also had some adherents in the day of Augustine. And this was the view that, okay, man is fully depraved, not fully depraved, but he is depraved. He is a child of Adam. Nature has changed. He is inclined toward evil. If God does nothing internally in the heart, God will never, not God, but man will never embrace the gospel. So far, it sounds exactly like Augustinianism. But here's the kicker. They said when God does open the heart, enable a person to be able to believe. So man is not making the first initiative. God is drawing him, supernaturally enabling him. But once he enables him, he does not necessarily have to believe. Some can believe and some can't. This is a prevenient grace kind of position. This is a semi-Augustinian. Essentially, this is Armenianism. This is traditional Baptist view that God needs to supernaturally, internally draw the heart, enabling him to be able to believe, putting him in a state where he can be free of his bondage to evil. And now in that enabled state, now that he's out of the prison, he can look around and the devil's saying, come to me. And God is saying, come to me. And he says, I'm going to God and I'm not going to you, devil. Okay. So he's now free to be able to do that. And man has the decision to choose in and of himself of whether he's going to choose God or choose the devil. So it's these two views in the middle, semi-Pelagianism and semi-Augustinianism, that historically during the day of Augustine and Pelagius were the two positions that it seems that...
Okay, we're going to pause at 9:54. Here's a passage from the conferences directly, so I'm not even reading from my dissertation. So you just, that way you're not going to get confused. Is this just Kurt's own interpretation or his own words, since some of that's mixed in with the dissertation? From the horse's mouth, the controversial Conference 13, and I say controversial because Prosper of Aquitaine, a disciple of Augustine, botches Cassian's work on this, and he attacks Conference 13 on this, which is a fascinating historical note, because usually when you're doing historical work and historical theology, you only have one side of the conversation. With John Cassian and his conferences, they've survived, and Prosper of Aquitaine's work against the conferencer also survives. So you can compare how Prosper treats John Cassian, and you can see if it's a fair analysis or not. And I'm just going to give you the spoiler alert, it's not. All right, John Cassian, Conference 13. The divine protection, then, is always inseparably present to us, and so great is the love of the Creator for his creature, that his providence not only stands by her, but even goes constantly before her. Did you get that? Providence not only stands by her, but also even goes constantly before her. Hence, human reason does not easily discern how the Lord gives to those who ask, is found by those who seek, and opens to those who knock. And on the other hand, how he is found by those who do not seek, appears openly among these who are not asking for him, and stretches out his hands the whole day to a people who do not believe in him, and who gainsay him. calls those who resist and are far away, draws the unwilling to salvation, removes from those who want to sin the means of fulfilling their desire, and graciously hinders those who are hastening on to what is evil. Wow, that doesn't sound like semi-Pelagianism. We need to understand Cassian's view of divine grace if we're going to fairly describe his viewpoints. All right, let's keep moving along. I'll find another passage.
The church councils during that time accept it. And so some initial ones seem to potentially accept the semi-Pelagianist view, and then eventually the semi-Augustinian view won out in that sense with the Council of Orange. So it's kind of debate. There was kind of an internal debate. Can we start making the first action and then God assist us into fully converting, or does God need to do that prevenient grace so that we can even make the first action or even be able then to freely accept? So that's the semi-Pelagian and the semi-Augustinian view. The semi-Augustinian view is what later Jacob Arminius came up with. And ultimately, this was his argument that Calvinism was wrong, irresistible grace was wrong, and we really should adopt this semi-Augustinian view. What's interesting about this is, again, history.
All right, here you go. Further along in Conference 13, this is chapter 11. These things are mixed together and fused so indistinguishably that which is dependent on which is a great question as far as many people are concerned. That is, whether God has mercy on us because we manifest the beginnings of a good will, or we acquire the beginnings of a good will because God is merciful. For many who hold to one of these alternatives and assert it more freely than is right have fallen into different self-contradictory errors. So this is what I would think is a slighted critique against Augustine, because Augustine explicitly tries to do this. He tries to figure out which one comes logically first, and Cassian says, no, these are indistinguishable from each other, so we cannot figure it out. So Cassian explains, for if we said that the beginning of free will was up to us, what was there in Paul the persecutor, and in Matthew the tax collector, one of whom was drawn to salvation, while intent upon the blood and torment of the innocent, the other upon violence and the plunder of public property? But if we said that the beginnings of a good will were always inspired by the grace of God, what should we say about the faith of Zacchaeus, and about the devotion of the thief on the cross? By their own desire they brought a certain force to bear on the heavenly kingdom, and anticipated the particular signs of their calling. But if we attributed the perfection of virtue and the carrying out of the commandments of God to our will, how do we pray, confirm, O God, what you have worked in us, and direct upon us the work of our hands? And we know that Balaam was brought to curse Israel, but we see that it was not permitted him to curse when he wanted to. He continues on and gives examples, and he sums this up. These two things, that is, the grace of God and free will, certainly seem mutually opposed to one another, but both are in accord, and we understand that we must accept both in like manner by reason of our religion, lest by removing one of them from the human being, we seem to contravene the rule of the church's faith. So, again, Cassian has a both-and view of the work of divine grace and human freedom. And to play this game of trying to figure out which one comes first leads to errors. And this is, I would contend, the error of Augustinianism. Cassian doesn't play by that game. So I'm going to close up here this reaction. I know I'm only 10:55, and others are welcome to continue watching. But here I think Martin probably draws from folks like Wayne Grudem and other systematic theologians who think that they've categorized Cassian's view accurately, and they haven't. They haven't, even for folks to reconcile the claims I've just read from the primary source, we can see Cassian does not fit that definition. Cassian believes grace is an internal work, and that it's a both-and operation of grace that comes even before the human makes the free will choice, in the sense that we can't figure out which one is which. So it's both the grace of God and the free will of man. It's a concurrent doctrine of grace. It's not one before the other. So I hope that's been a little enlightening for you. If you've never studied John Cassian, I want to encourage you to do so. He's written this great work called The Conferences. This is my more pristine copy. I have a not so pristine copy over on my shelf there. And if you've got questions, feel free to reach out to me. Check out veracityhill.com. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, other platforms, follow me on social media. I also have an e-newsletter list you can sign up at my website. And I'm looking forward to making more content about the Gallic monks. I think they really have a bad reputation. And if you want to see me debate some folks on this, I'm also open to debates. And so feel free to recommend to some folks who host debates on this subject matter. And I hope this has been valuable. Please comment. And please share with your friends as well if this has been a bit thought-provoking. And I want to ask you to, if you've thought semi-Pelagianism is this idea that that man can make the first step in the salvation process, I want to invite you to reconsider that maybe what you've been taught is wrong. It's inaccurate. It's not what the Gallic monks believed. And furthermore, they never would have accepted this label. So semi-Pelagianism is the boogeyman, because the boogeyman doesn't exist, and yet people are scared of it. So people are critiquing this view that no one actually holds. They're manufacturing outrage because John Cassian and others never believed that definition of semi-Pelagianism, that man takes the first step devoid of grace. It's not what they believed. I hope I've gotten the message across here, and I look forward to making more videos defending the rightful reputation of John Cassian, Vincent of Lérins, and Faustus of Ries.